Hello there. Welcome to the next installment of Scary Stories with Landlord Gurus. Um, we are talking about some of our personal experiences that we've had with our rental properties. It could be anything that's just either frightening or unsettling or just generally not fun. So,
Right.
um, Eli's got a story he's going to share with us today, especially as we get into fall and start thinking about our wintertime maintenance tasks that we need to take care of. But yeah, why don't you go
Yep.
ahead, Eli, get started.
Yep. So this was this year, and it was over a long weekend in January. I was out of state and I was skiing with friends. And first lift ride up, my phone started going off. And it's one thing if the phone rings, I get lots of spam. But when I ignore that call and or don't answer it, and then it goes off again, and then again, I knew pretty quickly that something was going on.
Right.
So it was one of my tenants, and this is in a three-story multifamily building that also has some offices in it. So there are apartments on top, offices, and then apartments below. And this was the ground level tenant, and there was water pouring out of the ceiling fixtures, the light fixtures,
No.
and out of multiple of them all over the place. And I had had calls from other tenants as well. So at any rate, what had happened is that this had been a very, very cold, there had been a real cold snap. It was down in the teens for multiple days in a row, and it had just started to warm up again. So a couple things that happened. One, it probably wouldn't have happened if I hadn't had a vacancy in one unit where I think that on the top floor where the heat was off. So here's a takeaway is to keep temperatures at least 50
Yeah.
in all units at all times. And I think a lot of times leases actually stipulate that tenants need to do that.
Yeah, you do see that often, and yeah, it is a good practice. Like if it's unoccupied, to yeah, especially
Right.
when it's cold. It is unusual to get that cold for us in
Yeah.
the Northwest. So.
Yeah, no, this isn't North Dakota, where that this would be a common thing, and the building would be prepared for it, or at least the pipe would have burst along. Oh, I gave it away. The pipe burst. Yeah. At any rate, and I didn't know, but some of the pipes I think go from one apartment to the other apartment. They went up when they remodeled the building. They went up into the crawl space attic, basically, which is real shallow, and they took the copper pipes across, and it had frozen. It was starting to warm up, and that's when the ice expands. It bursts the copper pipe. And then as it starts to thaw, that's when the water starts leaking. And it was just catastrophic. The top floor tenants were catching water in 5-gallon buckets and dumping it down the shower drain. And fortunately, they had the good sense to call, I think between them, they'd called both the fire department, who was busy all over the city running around turning water off at the street. So that's something good to know, is where to turn your water off to the building in case of an emergency, water emergency, because the water and fire are kind of the two quickest things to do major damage. And I think they'd also called the water utility. And I don't know whether it ultimately it was an hour or more before the fire department got there. They were 10th in the row when they did talk to the fire department, but they ultimately did get there, shut the water off. I have a great handy person who I was able to dispatch. I spent most of the day on the phone, and I was able to dispatch my handy person who was able to go help with cleanup and also really quickly just repair that burst line, so that it was only a matter of hours until I had water back on to my tenants. Because that's a horror story too. If people can't live in their spaces for long without water.
Right. Yeah,
So
and you had to turn the water off for the entire building.
entire building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Which was definitely the right thing for them to do. I now know where the shut off for each of those units is. And this is a building that's been updated fairly recently. So when they replumbed everything, they put a shut off for each unit in where the water heater is located. So that's a handy thing as well. And also, if you're doing some plumbing, put in localized shutoffs so that you can shut individual areas down.
so not
And
everybody would have to go without water if you weren't able to get that pipe fixed in a quick
right,
manner.
right.
It wouldn't
I
affect
mean,
everybody quite as well.
it'd be nice if you could know everything and remember it all right off, and then also have taught your tenants everything. It's not very realistic, but at least if I, off the top of my head, had remembered where that shutoff was, I could have directed them to it and could have shut things down maybe more quickly. And in a perfect world, I could have told the tenants, hey, if something happens, here's where your water shutoff is.
Mm-hmm.
It might not have worked either, because it might have been the vacant unit that would have been the one that had to be shut off. I don't actually know that, but Some takeaways are know where to shut the water off and also know who to call. And generally, I think the fire department is a real good go-to in a lot of ways. If people are smelling gas or if there's water, the fire department is a good resource and they're prepared. They'll break down a door if they have to get into a space where they can help. And so that was the right call and ultimately was the quickest way to get that water turned off.
So I've heard from other landlords who, whenever they have a new tenant move in, they provide sort of a three-ring binder of information about who to call when this happens and such. All these kind of different scenarios outlined and what the tenant should do, and which I think would be a really good idea, especially, if you're in a place where pipes might burst.
Yeah.
But something like that where and maybe the tenants file this away and they never look at it. But it could be something that when that comes up, they can go to it and they know who to call
Right.
if they can't get a hold of you right away.
Yeah. It's a great idea.
Yeah.
Sounds like a project to put on our list.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe we need some checklists. And yeah, having everybody know who to call is definitely a takeaway. It was chaotic for a good month or more after this because, like I said, this has happened all over the city. So getting people out to do work was difficult to do. Definite takeaway is to have everybody have their own renter's insurance because that will cover damage to their own belongings and also emergency housing. If I'm unable to provide housing because of a flood or some event like that, then renter's insurance generally covers that. So
because after the flooding, even though you got the pipe fixed relatively quickly, there was still a lot of cleanup and damage that you had to go through, which affected tenants for a little while still. Yeah.
Right. And the four-letter word mold is a concern then, right?
Yeah.
And so before I leave the insurance topic, though, I didn't until fairly recently, I didn't require renter's insurance, but it's just an absolute no-brainer at this point. It's not expensive. It's, it might be $15, $20, $25 a month for a tenant. I think it's usually less than that, actually, but they need it because if something like this happens, my insurance doesn't cover, the landlord insurance doesn't cover damage to their property or housing them. So they need it. And also, not only does renter's insurance cover damage to tenant's property, but it also covers if they do something that damages the building.
Right.
And we had this at another building where a guest, I think, was smoking on a deck and didn't put their cigarette out completely, started a fire that did a whole bunch of damage, didn't burn the building down, but created major damage. And their renter's insurance covered those repairs. So
sounds like a next installment for a scary story.
Yeah, I forgot about that one.
Yeah. So how do you enforce or how do you know that a tenant has gotten their tenant insurance?
Well, I now use a combination of Avail and Turbo Tenant, which are property management software platforms for those who don't already know. We've written about and reviewed pretty well all of them that are out there for independent landlords that are suitable for independent landlords. I'm using those two platforms, primarily Turbo Tenant right now. And in my lease, I require that tenants have it. And then those platforms both require the tenants to upload proof.
Okay.
And to include what the expiration date is. So then the expiration date comes up. Both of those platforms remind my tenant and me that this needs to be renewed and a new verification uploaded. Okay. So it's really handy. I don't know if I could track and implement that myself with, even the 20-something tenants that I have with expiration dates all over the place. So
right. Yeah, that's a common issue with landlords. Not a reason why they might not require landlord insurance, or they say they do, but they really have no idea how to
right.
know whether they do or not, or whether it's expired and they're still valid. So yeah,
good. Yeah, you still have to go and look at the document that they uploaded. Both Avail and Turbo Tenant, and I think a lot of the other platforms also sell renters insurance. So while they're signing the lease with me, electronically on Turbo Tenant, they can purchase their renters insurance through the platform and have it directly uploaded. So it's handy for everybody. So
great.
So that's a must. And then another real lesson for me out of this in the aftermath is to tear the Band-Aid off. If you have water damage, there's just no way around getting it dry. You have to get everything dry. And when in doubt, if you know there's insulation, any insulation that's wet has to come out because it won't dry in time and it'll rot. Keep the drywall wet, it'll rot the framing and it'll mold. What you need is moisture and warmth for mold to grow and time. And this is the biggest learning point for me. Ultimately, I did end up bringing in a mold remediation company but I wasn't able to get them in for, I think, probably 2 weeks or so. If there's no warmth, moisture, and time, mold can't grow. So I could have spared all of that expense, and they're expensive, because they have insurance, and it's a scary word, mold associated with it. So really, I should have just taken, and wherever it was wet, I should have taken the drywall down, all of the insulation out, and fans and dehumidifiers. So this is not my first flood. I've had other things happen. So I do have a dehumidifier and fans around. And so setting those up, once you have everything open, things dry out within a couple of days. So then you can put it all back together. And nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to be invasive and tear things apart. But there's no real way around it, because that's actually what the mold remediation people are going to do when they get there. And if they get there 2 weeks later, then mold may have started. So you have an additional issue that you have to treat for that. And you have to be worried about mold in the spores in the air, where you don't have that if you just tear the Band-Aid off and get the wet materials out of there.
Right.
So bite the bullet and just deal with it, unfortunately, is the takeaway. I also have a good moisture meter where I can place the moisture meter on a surface, and it'll tell me what the moisture level of that surface is. So, and drywall is very dry, generally. I think it was 9%, 7% or 9% humidity. So, when you put the moisture meter on there, this one has it both has prongs, that you can stick into a surface, and it has just a sensing surface. So when you put it on a surface and it's reading 35%, that this is, something's wrong. Yeah, drywall is real clear. It's easy to tell when it's wet.
Mm-hmm.
So, and all this stuff you can also rent. I've rented fans and floor blowers and dehumidifiers. The dehumidifiers were, they were all rented all over the city because of all of this flooding. So
right, when it's happening everywhere. So yeah, it might make sense to make the investment early on and get that stuff. Just
none of this. I mean, a dehumidifier, a simple one, not a big robust one, is 100 to 150 bucks. Yep. Mm-hmm. Big fans are not expensive, and so I have 2 of each kicking around, which I picked up when I needed them.
But it might make sense to get them before you need them, because as we know, like when everybody needs that same piece of equipment, there's a run on them at the hardware stores, and sometimes it's hard to find those fans, and you just can't get them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So this was I would say this is probably the biggest horror story of my landlording career, because it impacted 3 different rentals units, 3 different tenants, and residential tenants, and one of the offices. It was flooding from the ceiling through a unit, through an office, and then below, spread out, and impacted 2 below. So we had to take things apart, and we had to house, just to be out of goodwill, I arranged short-term rental, a VRBO, for the tenants that needed to be out immediately for the first couple of days, to get them to the point where they could talk with their insurance agents and get their renter's insurance in place. And they ultimately, I think some of them actually ended up having their renter's insurance pay for that same place, and they were able to stay there. But I had to get them taken care of first off. And I probably, strictly speaking, didn't have to pay for that lodging right off the bat. But these are also people who's, this wasn't my fault and it wasn't their fault, but I'm a housing provider. And to the extent that I can, I want to make sure that I'm providing them with what they're paying for. And so a balance of kind of goodwill and then them having insurance, so everything's covered and taken care of, was kind of the way I decided to go about it. But
yeah, good. No, that's good.
Yeah. Thankfully, it's all buttoned up, and a good lesson as well on making sure that you are insulating pipes inside and outside. So I just put the hose bib covers on at one of the buildings, the insulated covers on the hose bibs outside, so that they won't burst during the winter when it gets cold. And I got to get up there in the attic and stuff some more insulation in there. It's not fun, but it's better than.
Yeah, it's one of the necessary things to do.
Yeah,
for sure.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening.
Yeah, make sure you like and subscribe and get notifications for when these next ones are coming up. If you've got any horror stories of your own, feel free to include them in the comments down there, and let us know if you have any questions. Thanks a lot, everyone.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.